This is a panel which is called Frontier or Center, Ukraine's Place in the World. And I am very happy to introduce our guests. This is an event within our focus topic, Life on the Edge. And for those of you who followed our program, you could see that most of our events were actually with Ukrainians, about Ukraine, about frontline territories, about the war, with soldiers, with people from occupied territories. But we also try to talk about Ukraine's place in the world. And therefore, we really appreciate our friends who are coming from abroad. And believe me, this is an act, also an act of courage. So we very much appreciate your being here. Because abroad, it's always like Ukraine in flames and everything is, you know, the war, and as if there is no cultural life in Ukraine, which is of course not true. And we very much appreciate people who are coming here and who are supporting us. I'm very happy to introduce colleagues and my friends. I will start from Rory Finnin, who is a professor of Ukrainian studies at Cambridge University. Please welcome Rory. I will go to Bruno Maçães, who is a very prolific Portuguese book writer and author. And I can say that Bruno is a philosopher, but Bruno was also a civil servant and Minister for European Affairs of Portugal. So therefore, he has a very interesting experience in both state building and reflection. Bruno. Also, I'm very happy to introduce Botakoz Kassymbekova, who is a very well-known scholar from Kazakhstan, but she's now working in Basel University. She's an associate professor at the Basel University, and she's specializing in the topics which are so much important for Ukrainians right now: imperialism and colonialism. And I'm very happy that Botakoz is here because we lack this perspective sometimes in Ukraine. We lack the comparison of Ukrainian and Kazakhstan and you know, Central Asian, Caucasian experience, and this is very important. Please welcome. Last but not least, David Patrikarakos, who is a very old friend of Ukraine. I mean, he's very young, but very old friend of Ukraine, who is a British war correspondent and journalist whom I know for many, many years, and who is, you know, one of the first persons always to tell the story about this war and about Russian war crimes for the English-speaking audience. Please welcome. We are also waiting for one more speaker. I hope he will join us, and when he will join us, I will present you. Our goal is to discuss the role of Ukraine in the world, and I will start with Rory. Because, Rory, you are a person who works in Cambridge, but who speaks perfect Ukrainian, who reads Ukrainian, who translates from Ukrainian, but who also speaks Crimean Tatar, Kyrgyz language. And one of the Rory's fantastic book was from 2021 about Crimea and about connections between Ukrainian and Crimean culture, Crimean Tatar culture. But it seems to me that like when both Western and Ukrainian intellectuals were looking at Ukraine in the past decades, we were using this metaphor of borderlands, of frontier. And on the one hand, it is good because there is something very important happening on the borderlands. But on the other hand, it was kind of a pejorative, so it's very far away. Do you think that this metaphor was at some moment useful, but maybe at some moment harmful for Ukrainians? And can we say that Ukraine is really going into kind of a center of the history, of European history?
Well, first of all, such a great pleasure to be here with you, Volodymyr. I'd like to thank the organizers of Knizhkovy Arsenal. It is a wonderful privilege to be here and to be here with all of you. I also am very pleased to be here with my fellow panelists. And this question about intellectuals using the term borderland or frontier has us think about and discuss two different things. The first is, of course, this realm of imaginative geography, mental maps, the stories that we tell ourselves about the places that matter and the places that don't. That's the first issue. The second issue is how intellectuals, how scholars, journalists help shape and map this realm. And I think at the outset, as someone coming from the United Kingdom, it's important to say that scholars have mapped Ukraine poorly in the West for a very long time. We study Ukraine in the West usually through one dimension, maybe two, but never three. So we need a Ukrainian studies in the West in three dimensions. Another way of putting it is to say that we've studied Ukraine with arithmetic when we really needed calculus, or we studied it with classical physics, but we needed quantum mechanics, because even the title of this session is Frontier or Center. And in the West, that or, that conjunction or, was always emphasized. Whereas we here in Ukraine understand there's always an and in the background. This notion of being at once a frontier and a center is very important. This is the way that Ukrainian thought leaders from Mikhailo Hrushevsky to the geographer Stepan Rudnitsky to Vyacheslav Lipinski thought of Ukraine as a center, but a place that marked and mapped a crossing of different cultures, of different traditions of East and West. So in Ukrainian context, this notion of being a center and a frontier at once, at the same time, is something we can accept. In the West, it has been something that is thought of as one thing or the other, either a frontier or a center. So if we think about the West and Western intellectuals, Western journalists on the whole, there's been a tendency to see Ukraine as a borderland in two ways. One way is to think of a borderland as a place of attraction, a space of attraction. The other way is to think of it as a space of alienation. And so for many scholars, what was attractive about Ukraine was Ukraine is a borderland that is a space of attraction, that connects different kinds of peoples across its territory, from, if one thinks of Sloboda Ukraina, Russians, Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, or if we think about the Polish Kresy, bringing together Jews, Poles, Ukrainians. This was an opportunity for many Western scholars to study in this transnational, interdisciplinary way that started particularly in the 1990s with the work of Mark von Hagen and many others. But there's another school that sees Ukraine as a frontier or borderland that is a space of alienation. This is a space that is thought of as a buffer zone. This is the language that Richard Sakwa uses in his work of 2015. And this metaphor, Volodya, is extremely dangerous because we can connect the dot between Western scholars that write about and think about Ukraine as this gray zone, this buffer zone between the EU, Europe, and Russia. And we can trace its origin and we can trace its destination to the Kremlin, which is now using the same logic as well. So the West is complicit in simplifying Ukraine's position when it should have been amplifying its complexity.
That's very interesting. I would protect a little bit, defend the Western academia, because frankly speaking, I'm quite far away from it, but I follow the discourse, of course, and I know the names that you're mentioning. And I think, and I've read these books, and I think it's important that the conceptual apparatus that sometimes is emerging in Western academia, even sometimes it's very misleading, but sometimes it is very enriching and helping for us Ukrainians to better conceptualize our history. When you mentioned borderland and center, that's very interesting because this is precisely the concept of our focus topic when we're saying that borderlands is the center. What is happening there is actually defining what is happening in other parts of the world. What is happening on the front line in Ukraine defines what will happen in Kyiv. What will happen in Ukraine defines what will then happen in Paris and Berlin. But let me address David, and there is another topic, of course, because obviously the Ukrainians have this tendency to be self-centered, especially during the war. Every nation is more or less self-centered, but when you're in the war, which definitely has the global consequences, you sometimes are blind towards other processes in the world. So I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, who is Raji Abdul Salam, who is working for Reckoning Project. and a very well-known project that documents war crimes and connects journalism with law and with legal prosecution, and he is chief legal data analyst, archivist, I'm sorry. Continuing my question to David, we have been said a lot of times that the Hamas attack on Israel pushed Ukraine out of the center of attention. And therefore, in America, for example, Ukraine is no longer in the center of attention. And therefore, if Ukraine was in the center of attention in 2022, it is certainly not there now. Do you agree with this?
Well, I mean, I think to a degree that obviously the war in Gaza has taken up a lot of media bandwidth, sure. I mean, Ukraine is still very much on people's minds, and you see this in terms of the fact that I'm still being sent to the East to report on it. But sure, I mean, it is not as central as it was in 2022. But I think as someone who's been covering this war since, well, April 2014, when the war actually started, or perhaps even earlier with Crimea, I was very worried that, you know, after 24th of February, that it would last a month, 2 months, 3 months. But I'm actually, you know, quite heartened by the way it stayed in the preoccupations of people, especially in Britain and the West. So yes, it is not as front and center as it was, especially over the last, or especially since October the 7th. But I think Ukraine is still very much in the international bloodstream and in the international consciousness of people, and I'm very glad for that. Because this is never about, what is being fought out on the battlefields of Ukraine is not just about Russia and Ukraine. It is about Europe, it is about the broader Western globe, and that is not a cliche, it is not glib, I believe it to be true.
To continue my question, I was speaking recently with friends from UK, and they told me that, yes, on the first months of the Israel-Hamas war, Ukraine was not in the center. But then the readers were much more interested in knowing about Ukraine than in knowing about Israel-Hamas war. And the same story I heard from my French colleagues. So it's interesting in the way so that it is coming back to this.
Look, yes, because it comes back to my point that I made, that this is not just about Ukraine. That British and French, because you know, not that Gaza doesn't matter. It is more proximate. It is a threat. Look, I always say this, and I say that if Putin had conquered Ukraine in 3 days, as his lickspittles told him it would, he would be in Georgia by now. He would be in Moldova by now, because why wouldn't he? We know what he wants. So yes, this is a clear and present danger to people in Britain, to people in France, to people in Germany. They need to understand this, and I think increasingly there is an understanding of this. You know, Britain now is raising its defense spending. We're seeing now finally certain European nations allowing Ukraine to use certain weapons inside Russian territory. Things that should have been done before, fine, but it is happening. And the epicenter of this is Ukraine. Look, I've always said that I think in 2014 I saw the dawn of the 21st century in Ukraine for various reasons. And that continues to this day. All of the trends that I see on the battlefield, more narrowly, technologically, in terms of weapons, I'm seeing there. More broadly, politically, you know, the upturning or the end of, let's say, a Pax Americana that's held for 80 years, you can see them here in Ukraine. It's very much the center of everything for me right now.
It's very important for us Ukrainians to see not only our experience. And one of the obvious examples for me is what was happening in the 30s with Ukrainian peasants and Kazakhstan peasants. Am I right by saying that we actually facing the same process, like this collectivist idea of Stalinism, destroying on the one hand the individualism peasantry in Ukraine and nomadic peasantry in Kazakhstan, with kind of a famine, artificial famine on both sides? And if this perspective is right, maybe it's wrong, and you correct me, what does it say about Russian imperialism that probably people in the other parts of the world don't know?
Well, yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your question. I would first differentiate, because I'm a historian, so I will talk about kind of theories and approaches to studying imperialism, colonialism. How can we understand what is going on today? First, the difference between imperialism and colonialism. Imperialism, it is when a nation interferes into other nations or into other affairs somewhere else for the national interests. This is imperialism. Colonialism is when you send people who are governors on the spot. It's called men on the spot. So you don't simply interfere into affairs of other nations and other regions, but you actually send your envoys, your own people. They stay there and they rule in that place. You destroy the laws, the traditions of these people, and like from the metropole, the laws are more important than the local laws. So this is very important because people very often do not understand the difference between imperialism and colonialism. What kind of colonialism is Russian colonialism? And I'm referring to since 16th century. So a lot of people say, well, Russian colonialism is not really colonialism because in normal, well, what they say normal, but they take West European colonial systems, is that you describe the people, the native people who you colonize as others. They are the others. And Ukrainians, Russians say that Ukrainians are us, they are Russians. So this is the biggest difference. It's one of the biggest arguments. But this is a misunderstanding. It's a kind of technical misunderstanding that there are two types of colonialisms, generally speaking. So if we differentiate between colonialism that is interested in labor, this is exploitative, usually overseas colonialism, what you're interested in is to make people work for you. So you enslave people and these people work on cotton plantations, etc., for you. So if you are interested in labor of other people, then of course they are the others because they should not be equal to you. You put them as primitives, they need to be civilized, they're the wild people who work for you. In land colonialism, in settler colonialism, land empires, and Russia is a land empire, you're interested in the territory. So the logic is very different. So by exploitative colonialism, you do the othering, you do the others, you don't want to be associated with the people. In settler colonial systems, and this is Patrick Wolf's theory, it's not even, it's a general kind of colonialism theories. In settler colonial and land empires, what you need to do, you're interested not in the labor, you're interested in the territory. And in order to control this territory, what you need to do is you need to get rid of the natives, you need to get rid of the people. And there are two ways of how you get rid of the people who live there. You genocide them, or you destroy their culture, you assimilate them. So there are two different types of destruction that you need to do. And first of all, you need to cleanse the land for yourself so that your people will come and live there. This is what is happening in Mariupol today, and this is what is happening in Crimea. Since 2014, 800,000 settlers, Russian settlers came. This is a classical Russian colonialism. You cleanse people, you send Russians there. So, but why do you do assimilation? And of course, you eradicate traditions and laws, local governance structures. This is all settler colonial empires do that, not only Russian Empire. But assimilation is very important. It's very important to make people into Russians, in our case, in this case, to get rid of as one historian of settler colonialism, Lorenzo, I'm sorry, I forgot his last name. What he says is that we need to get rid of sovereign capacities because your language, your traditions, your kind of ways of thinking gives you sovereignty, gives you mental sovereignty. And as long as there is mental sovereignty, you are dangerous for the colonizer because your language, your traditions, your myths, your stories give you power. And to disempower you, to get rid of you, you need to be assimilated. So as Kyrgyz writer Chingiz Aytmatov is saying, and who invented this word mankurt, is that to enslave people, you need to get rid of their culture, so that, and once you assimilate it, you become Russian, you can control the territory. And can I give an example, very quick example? So sometimes it's easier to look at the examples of other empires. For example, the US colonization, we have Black American slaves. These are deported people to the United States. And we have Native Americans. And so Patrick Wolf looked at these kind of two colonized people, and he found out that the laws for these two kinds of people are very different. So for example, the one black blood of drop rule for black people. So for example, 38 generations. If back in your family, 38 generations, one person was black, in your passport you would be black. So there was recently woman who is blonde and blue-eyed came to make a passport, and it found, when she got a passport, her race was black. And she found out why, like 20 generations ago, there was somebody, a black person. And for native, and so the rule was, if a white person marries a black person, the children will be black, grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren will be black. For Native Americans, if a Native American married a white American, the children will be automatically white. And he asks, so why is that for these two different colonized groups, we have these two different rules? And he explains, so what one needed from black Americans was labor. So you other these people, because the more slaves you have, the better it is for you. So what you need to keep people differently, and they need to work on cotton plantations, they are the others. From Native Americans, we needed land. And so that we assimilate them so they don't claim the land back. So all the logic of colonization, of colonial rule, what to do with these people so that they don't claim the land back, so they lose their sovereign capacities. And so the Russian kind of settler colonial land empire, if you look at the map of the world, there is no way Russia could become so big without colonization, of course. I mean, this is getting those territories and making sure that these people from whom we got these territories will not claim their land back. So genocide, assimilation, these are the two major, and of course getting rid of their institutions, their traditions, to keep them docile.
I think the Russian, it's very, very interesting, very deep, but I think the Russian colonialism with regard to Ukraine, it combines the two. Because Russians definitely need Ukrainians as labor, and we know all the stories from the early modern times. Ukrainians were sent to build St. Petersburg, and this was and were killed there, and then gulags, and then everything, right? But there is one very important difference that many people in the West who don't know these theories don't understand, because the idea of this colonialism is, equalized with the idea of racism. Like you colonize and you make a difference with the colonized, and you say you're different than us, and then there is hierarchy. Whereas in our case, it's what you said. It's not the idea of difference, which is a tool of domination, but the idea of sameness. Like you are the same with us, you will never become different than us.
Yeah, maybe just to, I totally agree, no colonialism is an ideal type. Even though historians do ideal type formulas, no colonial system, it's always a mixture.
Ideal type, you mean in these Weberian terms, like the pure types, right?
Yeah, I mean the formula of different colonial regimes. And I forgot to mention the third kind of governance technique in settler colonialism is deportation. So if we look at black American slaves, they were deported to America, and didn't need to assimilate them because they were deported, because they were not at home, not in their native lands. There was no reason for them to claim land. So you could do with them whatever you want. So this is why you deported Ukrainians, you deported Chechens, you deported all this. This is why kind of Russian colonialism has a lot of deportations, because if you uprooted people will not claim their land back because they're foreigners. You need to constantly keep them foreign. Whereas settlers is a different thing, and then you settle. So one last example. So when Mikhail Gorbachev and George Bush were talking in 1989 in secret conversations with each other, and Bush asked, what about the Baltic countries? People don't want to be part of the Soviet Union. What will you do? And Gorbachev said, no, we cannot give Baltic countries independence because 50% in Estonia and Latvia are Russians.
Yeah, because they were brought there.
And this is like a classical settler colonial argument. You uproot people, you deport them to Siberia, and you settle with settlers.
Well, the same story we have with Crimea, obviously, and I will turn to Rory to explain that a little bit later. But I would ask Botakoz to think about one thing that I don't really understand yet, is how Russia combines this assimilation despite racial or physical difference. How, for example, Buryats who are coming here are saying we are Russians. Just think about this. This is very important because there is an element which is at work here. I want to address Bruno. Bruno, you know the world very well. You are a last chevalier of the great Portuguese Empire. No? But you really know the world very well. You know China very well. You try to understand what is going in the Asia. And of course, since many decades already, we hear that the center of the world has turned to Asia. America is not interested in Europe anymore. America is interested in the Pacific. And Russia for America, and maybe even for Europe, was perceived as a secondary threat. And then there are attempts to make kind of a anti-Kissinger. So Kissinger tried to engage with China against Soviet Union. Let's try to engage with Russia against China. This was an idea of very different people, from Trump to Emmanuel Macron. What is happening now? Is it really that we see recentering of the world to the Pacific, to the Asia? And if yes, what does it mean for us? Because Ukrainians are saying, we're going to Europe, we're going to Europe. But we're kind of a bit late because Europe is not the center of the world anymore.
Yes, I think this recentering of the world towards Asia has had a direct impact on the war here. It's not always seen. I think many people make the mistake of thinking the war is between the West and Russia and forget about the larger framework. Let me give you an example. Why is the Russian economy still going? You know, President Biden, 3 days after February 24th, he said, we are going to collapse the Russian economy. You can look that up. Why didn't it happen? Well, because the world is very different from what it was and from what Biden thinks it is. I think Putin knew this a little bit better. He knew that he would be able to continue exporting oil and gas because he would be exporting it to India and to Indonesia and to China. What we saw was essentially a reshuffling of the oil trade. Europe doesn't buy from Russia as much. It buys from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia doesn't export as much to India. Russia does. It's a pure reshuffling. It's allowed Russia to finance its war machine. And it's had a huge impact. Even the oil cap, the oil price cap, has not been effective. Why? Because the United States has not been able to impose it on India, for example. It would have been very easy to say, you are subject to the same limitations, Indian buyers. You cannot buy Russian oil above $60 per barrel. But the US decided not to do it. Why? Because it needs India in its balancing game against China. So this is just two examples of how this larger Eurasian chessboard is impacting the war in Ukraine. I have no doubts, for example, that if the world economy were still what it was 20 or 30 years ago, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine, because it knew that its economy would not be able to survive the shock. But the threats that were made before February 24th were completely ineffective, and the obvious reason is that Russia knew that it could survive and turned out to be right. You know, many of us have been pointing out, and many of us are a bit puzzled, that we expected on February 24th the Russian army to do well, better than it did, and we expected the Russian economy to do much worse than it did. It was a surprise from that point of view. By the way, I think this also connects to your big topic, Volodymyr, that if you see the world from this perspective, then Ukraine is at the center. If you see the world from the perspective of the West against the rest, then Ukraine is in a periphery. So I think the first framework is much better for Ukraine. By the way, I think President Zelensky sees this very well. And he doesn't do more to universalize the question, because many times he's not allowed by Washington. But today, he's in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue. He seems very concerned that China is not going to be present in Switzerland for the peace conference. He seems not to like at all the American idea of turning China into a participant and an adversary in the Ukraine war. He has never gone along with that, but you've seen that in the past 2-3 weeks, there's been an attempt in Washington to present China as a direct participant, with claims that there is Chinese military equipment in the battlefield in Ukraine. I don't know if there is or there isn't, but we haven't seen any indication of that. And by the way, I think that if Ukrainian troops posted something on social media showing a clearly identified Chinese military equipment, Ukraine is not the kind of place where this could be stopped, even if the authorities wanted to keep it on the reps. So I remain very skeptical, but the big point is that Ukraine has to be careful about this idea that it's a war of the West against the rest, because then we get into this dynamic of, is Ukraine really part of the West? And let me finish with a quote from a member of the National Security Council in the US, who a year ago told me the following, that the way the National Security Council thinks about war is like this: we will support Ukraine in wherever Ukraine needs, provided it doesn't raise the risks for the US or for NATO members. There are three levels: the US, NATO members, Ukraine. We're willing to support Ukraine in whatever is necessary, provided that support does not increase the risks for the US or for NATO members. This is the mental framework that is dominant in the National Security Council, in the Biden administration, and it's the mental framework that explains why there's so much resistance to striking Russian targets inside Russia, because it is considered that at this point the risks for NATO members and for the US would rise. So it is a dangerous framework, and it's a framework that leaves a large part of the world out of the discussion. So I would try to resist it, but again, I think President Zelensky has been resisting it from the very beginning.
We will go with this question to Raji a little bit later, and I will ask you about the very bad concept of global south, but I will stay with Bruno a little bit. So you mentioned this mental framework, but what do you see, I mean, in the future? I'm primarily interested in China. Because what we see here in Ukraine, that, yeah, the West is very careful, but there is a certain trend of history. And the trend of history is that the West is more and more engaged into this war, so it gives more and more weapons to Ukraine. Russia is more and more saying to its own population that this is a war against the West, and China is engaging more and more with Russia. So we heard today Blinken actually admitting that US would be okay with strikes on Russian territory. Does this mean that basically we are, because I really agree with you that we need to focus on micro level here, on human lives, on human suffering, on all this very important stuff, but we also need to see the macro picture. And the macro picture is that it's much bigger than Ukraine war, right? It's actually not even the war between, let's say, European idea and the Russian idea. It's a war between, you know, an idea where individual matters, and this is a liberal idea, and the system where the individual doesn't matter. And the system where individual doesn't matter is not so much Russia today, but China.
Well, the interesting thing about the war in Ukraine here is that it can be part of the two big mental frameworks that come from the 20th century. Either a war between democracy and autocracy, World War II and then the Cold War, and it's easy to see how Ukraine can be part of this story. But for most of the world, it's useful to remember, for most of the world, this is not the primary mental framework that describes the 20th century. For most of the world, the primary mental framework is the war against colonialism. And it's the struggle for independence against colonial powers. But interestingly, Ukraine also fits very well into this narrative. And in that case, you would actually present Russia as the last European colonial power. I've tried to do this in many conferences, saying, you know, Portugal was actually the penultimate colonial power. Russia is going to be the final colonial power that gives up on colonialism. And I think across the world, in my experience, this is the framework that really resonates and that brings people closer to Ukraine, more than the first one. Now, on China very quickly, because I think it is very interesting. China is complicated. So if you ask me directly, do you think China was happy with the invasion? I feel very confident from my conversations in Beijing that China would have preferred if Russia had not invaded. And I can justify that later. I don't want to take too much time. But it's also very clear that China will not let Russia collapse, because it feels that the world will be more dangerous for China with a collapsed Russia, that perhaps will come under Western control. So this is very delicate for Ukraine. because it creates a certain difficulty. If Ukraine started to push back Russia, directly threaten Crimea, perhaps launch an offensive to recover Donetsk, at that point I worry very much that Russia would move from the current position, which I consider is of essential non-interference, into a position where it would support Russia. So this is a delicate problem that I'm not sure how to solve, but it poses an obstacle on the way of Ukraine's victory, for sure.
But at the same time, it confirms this dynamic that step by step, it is going wider and wider. And people in the West can use this concept of, oh, we are against escalation, but this is where it all goes, from both sides. Let me ask Raji, what do you think about this idea of Global South? Because on the one hand, I hate this concept. On the other hand, we don't have any other. So if I say non-Western world, it's even more pejorative. It's even more bad. So Ukraine is trying to engage now. It suddenly realizes that the world is much bigger than the Western world. This conversation, and Bruno mentions what President Zelensky is doing, not only President Zelensky, but clearly the trend is there. Because we understand that, of course, we need the West primarily. We need the West for military help, etc. But we cannot persuade the West unless we engage with Global South, because the West is thinking how Global South thinks about the West. And this is a very strange dynamics. But then, do you think that Global South exists? Or maybe it's just a plurality of many, many different places? And if you would say that it's a plurality of many different places, where we have better chances, I think that we have good chances in Latin America because there is much to say, actually. We have good chances with people who, in Syria, for example, who hate Assad, or broader in the Middle East. We have good chances in some African countries, but we have bad chances in some others.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. I have to say two things before I start talking. The first one, I apologize for being late, for my respectable colleagues and for the audience.
We apologize for starting before you came.
Still, I have to do it myself. The second one, I have to go back little for the discussion that I started to have with our respectable colleague and you about colonialism, Russian colonialism and assimilation. Because from my very little experience through my archiving as documents of war crimes, crimes against humanity and concern of attempted genocide in Ukraine, I started to find certain element that the semantic of the word assimilation is little different when it comes to Russian. So one of the things that really struck me is the way that they dismiss the Ukrainian entities by saying that you are Russians. They have like this dogmatic thinking, you are Russians, but you are not experiencing the Russianness. So that means your experience is irrelevant. We will dismiss it. And then they start to have what is the Russian identity that we didn't experience because we are your Russian. Then you discover that we don't know because it's our identity argument. And then they wanted to make it collective identity argument that leads to more paradox. So when you talk to them about it, or they want to create a book for school to push it in Ukraine, you find the paradox. So how people are Russians as you depend and you are dismissed their own experience as Ukrainians, but at the same time you know that they are Russians, but you will dismiss them. So the assimilation here basically is a mayhem, is a mental mayhem. Just to go for this point. We can argue about it if you feel like it. Let's go back to the second point about the Global South. I agree with you. The Global South is not homogeneous. It's not even heterogeneous. It's basically layers upon layers that they don't mix. And every place has its uniqueness and specificities. But we have to have a standard. And the standard, you cannot give compassion, you know, as on nationality. Like in this area or this area, I cannot feel compassion for Ukrainians. Sadly, the player here is interest. And the Russians, they played a very bad role in so many places, like in Syria, like in Iraq, like in Africa. But at the same time, they have interests, African governments especially, they have interests. The Syrian regime, he has interest with the Russians. So basically, who we are addressing here? A certain government or the audience. So who's our person that we are trying to address? The second point, from my view as a person who built legal cases, so when we thought of a place, we cannot do build a case against Russian entities in so many African countries because of the interest. They have the universal jurisdiction. We saw South Africa and other places, you know, with perfect respect for them. It's they are their own sovereignties. But if you look, there are Russians influence there. So that would be basically encountered by having the moral standard that you cannot be compassionate with the Palestinians but not the Ukrainians, you know, or you cannot be compassionate with the Egyptians but not the Ukrainians, or the Ethiopians when they have problems with Egypt, you know, I'm more with Ethiopia, you know. Morality cannot be selective, and compassion cannot be selective. You have to be honest, or it will be like schizophrenia. So the best chance for us we found in Latin America. I agree with you. So when we wanted to build cases, we went to Argentina. Now we are going for other places. We didn't think of Europe because Europe is already so supportive to Ukraine somehow. You know, I'm not Ukrainian, so I cannot really evaluate this. But somehow they are supportive, you know? So we were thinking of an impact. So we were thinking of Africa. We were thinking of 3 countries. But then we found it's very difficult because, first of all, there is a very strong Russian propaganda and misinformation in Africa. This is reality. We have to discuss it. So how is our plan to encounter that as people who wants to fight the compassion fatigue? This is another story, because even the people who support Ukraine, they feel fatigue, compassion fatigue, because they cannot always support Ukraine. So you have to bring Ukraine now again by saying, no, you shouldn't stop. It didn't finish. You have to give them pressure and emotion, you know? So also this is a question we have to answer together. I'm going to stop here just to make sure I will not take more from my colleagues' time.
Thank you, thank you. This is very important. So the idea of this certain universality of compassion is a very good moral idea. The problem is that it never happens in the real life. So people are very selective in compassion, and it also concerns Ukraine. So it's a big question how to extend the horizon of your compassion, of your empathy. Rory, let me address you, and let us talk about maybe continue what we have been talking with Botakoz. What can be the Ukrainian story to the world in light of this? Not only the Ukrainian ethnic story, but the Ukrainian Crimean Tatar story that you studied. What is that for example, can provide a certain recipe, a certain solution even to problems that the world is facing? For example, can we say that the level of dialogue between ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Crimean Tatars right now, between Christians, Jews, and Muslims today in Ukraine, can be a message to the world that, look, religions can coexist, and they can coexist peacefully? Or can we use the deportation example that Botakoz was mentioning as an example? Look, this happened with Kremlin. This happened with, I don't know, Poles in the Western Ukraine after the Second World War. This happens with Ukrainians in Poland after the Second World War. This happens with Romanians. This happened with Meskhetians in Georgia. This happens with so many places. And this is one of the elements of Russian imperialism or colonialism. And this is what is happening today. The deportations. I always say that why Russians are bombing schools? Because this is a deportation by missile strikes. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I began answering your first question with this reference to imaginative geography, mental maps, and it's important you mentioned the global south, but also the west. These are terms that are effectively concepts that we use, but really aren't in a technical sense helpful when it comes to this broader message of how Ukraine and how we, as those who cover Ukraine in some way, either in journalistic life or in academic life, how we should reach different audiences, because we have to think about different messages for each country, for each community within the country. And this issue that Bruno raises about, do we frame in the West and in Great Britain and the United States Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine as a struggle between democracy and autocracy and tyranny? As usual, I think with Ukraine, the logic of both and rather than either or is the most useful. And for us, if that message works, we should use it. At the same time, your point about colonialism and a war of independence is well taken. It's an important way of framing this war. But I would take it one step further. This is not simply the story of a colonial power, a tyrannical power, seeking to conquer a country and a people. It's not just the story of them seeking independence, but it's also a story of the empire coming back to reconquer what had been independent for some time. So for us to speak to those who have been colonies of Portugal, the UK, to talk about what it would be like to think about the British coming back to India, what it would be like for them to go back to Nigeria, that is, for us, another step we have to take. So this is where Crimea is very important. Because in the West, there has been a collective amnesia about Crimea. There was attention to the annexation operation in 2014. Maybe about 6 months to a year, there was attention. But world attention moved away from it. And we saw the consequences. The peninsula is militarized in terms of physical military materiel, but also a militarization of consciousness took place. The West ignored it as best they could. We saw the consequences when in 2022, Russian troops tear into the Kherson Oblast and invade Ukraine from their own territory. This ignorance and this forgetting of Crimea is exactly the kind of thing that I see taking place with respect to other occupied territories of Ukraine. And this is why I'm not as generous about the Western academic community. I see, unfortunately, various intellectuals becoming quite comfortable and accustomed to what's taking place, and I do not feel comfortable sitting back and watching it happen once more. However, Ukraine can tell this story about colonialism, as Botakoz mentioned, through the example not only of Crimea, but also of so many parts of the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. The one thing I think that has been a major achievement of this presidential administration has been the Crimea platform that was founded by Zelensky's administration in 2019, which has been really actively reaching out to different states and communities in the global south to make sure that they, number one, realize that Ukraine is a diverse, multi-ethnic community. It's a state with many different kinds of people that are still committed to the Ukrainian idea, that still have a tradition of anti-colonial resistance to both Polish aristocracy, Russian autocracy. So using the experience of Crimea, and particularly the connection that Crimean Tatars have with the Ukrainian state, the loyalty and the solidarity that in the whole, and there are exceptions, has been a really remarkable success story. It is, I think, a very important way for us to reach out to Indonesia, for instance, the largest Muslim country on the planet, to make sure that they understand Ukraine is a place not with blonde-haired Slavic peoples, but many different kinds of Slavic peoples, and then to tell the story about ethnic groups, and particularly Muslim communities that have seen their mosques, their homes stolen, their communities destroyed and razed to the ground. These are narratives that do reach people abroad in the so-called global south, And I think we need to keep nuancing our messages to each of these communities so as to present Ukraine as it's been in history, and as I think in the West we simply reduced it and simplified it too often.
I want to stay with you, Rory, because these are very important topics. What Rory is talking about is actually re-imperialization and recolonization. And I want you, all of you, to think about this. But let me stay a little bit with Ukrainian culture. Because you mentioned in the first comment these wonderful names like Rudnitsky or Lipinski or others. And I think the task of Ukrainians is now to rethink our intellectual tradition in the way how it suggests some universal ideas. And I will just fantasize with you, and maybe you will continue like in a jazz improvisation. So I would tell you that Kotlarevsky's Aeneid is a story about how you should strive to rebuild your home after losing your home. I will tell you that Shevchenko is a story, Taras Shevchenko is a story how you think and fight for freedom inside slavery. And therefore, by the way, Shevchenko has so much universalist appeal because he has a poem about Caucasus and he has a paintings of Kazakh peasants, which are very empathic and a big contrast to the Russian literature about both Central Asia and the Caucasus. I can tell you that Drahomanov is a story about the force of self-organization. I can tell you that Lesya Ukrainka is one of the first environmentalist poets. I take the concept from Askold Melnichuk. What would you say?
I completely agree, 1000%. I think it's very important to connect, the lines "Enable parabok motorny I chlopec od kudy kozak" with that of Sadok Vishneve Kolohate, because these are stories about home that also have a very important political and cultural subtext. And again, not to completely beat up on Western academic studies of Ukraine in this region, but that subtext was widely ignored. So, as you say, the story of the Zaporozhian Cossacks being conquered, we have to remember the siege was destroyed by Catherine. And so often I hear people talk about, well, colonialism first has to begin with a moment of military conquest. And that didn't happen in Ukraine. Completely incorrect. It absolutely happens in Ukraine at the end of the 18th century. The siege is raised, the hetmanate broken apart. And so those Cossacks going to find for themselves a new home is an amazingly provocative political story that is told in a very humorous way. And at the same time, you have with someone like Shevchenko, this desire to be at home, this image and this fantasy of being at home even when he's in prison and in exile. These stories are all a part of a narrative of anti-colonial resistance that is coherent. And so this is, again, a point that relates to the question of center. You can see a mainstream, you can see a center to Ukrainian culture, all the culture that we see around us here, and at the same time, you can see moments of gestures to other cultures, to moments in which being a borderland, being caught between three different imperial traditions was difficult. It had terrible traumatic effects on society over centuries, but at the same time, it produced a cultural energy. So I think that's why the study of Ukrainian culture for someone in Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard, Columbia, you name it, is probably the most exciting kind of academic work one can do, and it's important to seize up on that energy and remember it as much as we can.
Thank you, Rory. I would like to ask the same question for Bruno, for Raji, for David and Botakoz. The question is very simple, but at the same time very deep. And I mean, deep not because it's a question from myself, but because it's a phenomenon very, very important to reflect upon. But I will ask you to reflect upon from your different perspectives. And the question is, to continue what Rory said, are we living in the epoch of recolonization or re-imperialization? Because we were so happy, as Bruno and Raji was saying, about this idea of decolonization of the late 20th century. We can read all the 20th century through these lines. Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire in the First World War, Russian Empire recollects itself, then the German Empire, Italian Empire collapsed in the Second World War, but the Second World War leads to the collapse of the British Empire and then, French Empire, etc. And you can see the Russian, what happened in 1991 as a continuation of this. But then you can see at Russia at different points of reinventing its empire. It happened with the Bolsheviks, then it happened with Putin. And then it happened probably earlier. And if we look at the 19th century, we see very romantic movement of the Printemps des Peuples, the springtime of the nations, but then we see recolonization, re-imperialization of Europe in the late 19th century, which led to the First World War. So are we living in this epoch of recolonization, and that means that basically 21st century will be a century where new empires will be born, and when the idea of democracy will be in a very big trouble. Let's start with David.
So to answer your question, do I think we live in an age of recolonization? I think the answer is probably emphatically yes, but it's a symptom of a broader process that I'm talking about. We're talking about the unraveling of an international settlement. You know, we're talking about the end of the Cold War, where if you look at a place like the Middle East, we had two superpowers that kept things in check on the ground. Look, when ISIS crossed from Iraq into Syria, they made a point of demolishing the Sykes-Picot borders, right? This may be 100 years ago, but it's still very much alive in the imagination or the public consciousness. So yes, when these settlements break down, when bipolarity, which brought a certain security in the Cold War, breaks down, you get powers like Russia seeking to reinvigorate, to reconquer, to reinstall their empires. But I'm saying this is a symptom of something broader. We're seeing it everywhere. We're seeing people trying to break down what they still to be colonial barriers, artificial states created by the British and French in the early 20th century. And we're seeing, when one empire ends, things become looser, become more flexible, other empires try to rise. The US was never an empire in that sense, but there is a sense that is fading. We're seeing across the globe all manifestations of recolonialism. It's extraordinary to me that, we still have, in a certain sense, post-colonial struggles now, when, colonialism, a lot of it was unraveled in the 50s. But I'm saying on both sides we're seeing it, so emphatically yes, and it's a symptom of something broader.
Yes, I think we never overcame colonialism. And I'm not going to blame anyone in particular. I think there wasn't a genuine reflection, effort to learn from the mistakes of colonialism. In Europe, it's coming back. In Europe, there's now a very strong, deep nostalgia for the 19th century. And in fact, think about it this way. If you look at the far right in Europe, where do you find far-right parties that support Russia rather than Ukraine? You find it in all the imperial powers. You find it in France, you find it a little bit in Spain, you find it in Hungary. Where do you find far-right parties that actually support Ukraine? You find it in Poland, or at least a conservative party. Why?
Italy?
And Italy, exactly. Not a traditional European colonial power by any means. Why? Because the far right, nostalgic about the past and nationalistic, in Poland and Italy, it thinks about its own national identity. In Poland in particular, it thinks about its struggle against colonialism. Whereas in France, it thinks back to its glorious times as a colonial power. So we haven't overcome colonialism. And this is, of course, what people all over the world complain about. Let me finish with Gaza before I lose the opportunity. I traveled a lot in India, in China, in Africa in 2022. And everyone was telling me, when something like what is happening in Ukraine happens in our part of the world, the West is not going to support us, is going to support the people doing what Russia is doing. Now, whether this is entirely fair or not, it's what people think in many parts of the world. But let me give you a couple of what I think are indisputable examples of a Western contradiction. I was in Lviv, Volodymyr was there as well last year, and we talked about how to punish the Russian propagandists that are every night on television advocating for genocide. And everyone agreed there's still not a framework of punishing them criminally, but many of them are sanctioned. Now, on Israeli TV, every night there's people advocating for genocide. Is it even conceivable that the European Union would sanction these people? No, it isn't. But people in Africa, in India, in Latin America, they see the contradiction. ICC issues an arrest warrant against Putin. The Biden administration celebrates it as a great victory of law and the rules-based order. Now, the prosecutor of the ICC requests the issuance of an arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu and his Minister of Defense. What was Biden's reaction? He called it outrageous. So how do you want the rest of the world to look at the Ukraine war when they see this unbelievable contradiction? So to answer your question, it's not that we're returning to colonialism, it's that in many respects we haven't overcome it. There's still a task for the 21st century.
Yeah, I just want to come in quickly. I would be reluctant to make too many parallels between Ukraine and Hamas, because obviously Ukraine didn't start this by doing an October 7th style atrocity against Russia.
David, I made a parallel between the people advocating for genocide on Israeli TV and the people advocating for genocide on Russian TV. You don't think they are equally to blame, or is genocide acceptable in some places?
Well, look, certainly there are people on Israeli TV, and look, they have issued, or they're about to issue a warrant for Netanyahu, so I don't think he's getting away with it scot-free, is he? I don't think that's entirely fair. But I certainly agree with the arrest warrant sent out for Putin, and we'll see what the ICC says about Netanyahu when it makes its final ruling.
Interestingly, that the Ukrainian question is not provoking so much discussion and debate than the question of Israel and Hamas war. And this is also a very, I think, important symptom. But let me come back to my question, Botakoz.
Yes, should I talk about Burats first, quickly?
Yes.
And, yes. And Raj, to your question, so why is that Burats are kind of saying you're Russian and go and kill, and at the same time Ukrainians are not saying you're Russian, like you're simply Russian, right? So assimilation is a hierarchical process. Russianness is not simply an ethnicity, it's not nationality, it's a status category. It's an imperial status category that is expressed in the ability to dominate others. So when Russians go to two Burats and say, now you can become Russian, so now you can go and dominate others, it's a status category. For Ukrainians, Russians is not a higher status, so you cannot attract Ukrainians and say, okay, now you will become Russian, go and dominate others. You cannot speak to Ukrainians like that, so you say, you are just Russians. There is no that logic of assimilation, because Burats are now colonized and Ukrainians are free. That's why the logic of assimilation will be different. To your question about if we should look at it as the period of assimilation or of recolonization, I am a historian, so I'll speak from a historical perspective. One of the best historians of the Soviet Union, Martin Malia, in 1989, predicted everything that is happening today. So in 1989, before the Soviet Union collapsed, he said, and he was talking about Gorbachev and the West should not help Gorbachev, should not send him money, because there is no way that Gorbachev can reform the Soviet Union. He said that totalitarian Soviet communism is not reformable. So every time we help, we will just keep this system alive. So he predicted that with the collapse, with the possible maybe collapse, and maybe I'm overinterpreting it a little bit, but reading rudely, he said that if the Soviet Union collapses, Moscow will try to stick to the colonized and in case will reconquest the nation. So he predicted it. So what is happening now for historians is not a big question. There is a logic. It's not simply, okay, let's recolonize, let's enter the period of recolonization. There is a logic to Russian colonialism and how it was cemented during the communist era. There is some logic into that they need to expand. So it was predicted for several historians. They kind of predicted it that Vladimir Bukovsky, for example, already in December 1999, he said the country is lost. They will probably do recolonization. It started with Chechnya. So recolonization started in 1993, and I wouldn't say it's a new period. There is an intrinsic logic to that, and there are smart historians who analyze it in a kind of mathematical formula style, who predicted it, and they were right. So I wouldn't say it's a new period. I mean, as a historian of kind of Russian colonialism.
The question is, but this is for another discussion, is how should we think about imperial reinvention, because we see the Russian Empire as reinventing itself. And we see, by the way, Europe is also reinventing itself, but in a completely different way. Because Europe has reinvented itself after the Second World War in a completely different way than Russia reinventing actually the same thing. Maybe 1 minute, yes, Botakoz, if you have something to say.
Well, I think Russians have a problem of reinventing themselves. I think they don't have a story. They never figured out their colonial story. They never figured out their national story. That's why you see, you know, everything. They take everything. And that's, from one side, is their weakness and is their strength. Because they don't have a story, they can tell anyone anything. You know, they are not, they don't stick to their values, but they are not abided by their values. They are not abided by their story. They are very, very flexible. They can improvise. They can lie. Basically, there is no truth. So because there is no story, there are no values, and the values do not control them. And it's from one side their strength, but in the long term, that will be the reason for their fall.
It's interesting that I agree with you that current Russia doesn't have a story, but it's interesting coming back to the discussion with Bruno, because it's all the discussion about the future. Like, it's all the discussion who owns the future. And Russians are saying, you, the West, you don't own the future because you're collapsing. But the problem is that Russia doesn't have a future of its own. It has a Chinese future. It's only have this whole thing because it thinks that it will rely upon China, upon Asia. But this is another story. Raji, the question about recolonization.
Actually, it's amazing. Thank you for your intervention, and thank you for questions, because I was about to ask about it, about Russian inventing themselves. What I see when we talk about colonialism and the concept of colonialism in my head and the existence of the Russian state now, to me, if I think of them as a colonial state, to me it's over exaggeration, because from your talk now and what I understand, I look at this entity as a teenage boy who inherited the tools of his mom or his dad. And the tool is effective somehow, but he does not have the ideology to run this tool right. So it takes us again to the beginning of it. The question about how could I be a colonial entity if I don't have a strong ideology to back it so I can claim my superiority, or to convert people to, or to dismiss other people, to assimilate them, or whatever, you know? So what I see is someone who's using tools for I don't know which purpose. They just want to erase something that they don't understand. And in the end of the day, they cannot afford to expand, you know? So this is the big questions. It's an utter nonsense what they are doing. Maybe I am a bit political here, but this is what I see. They have no future, as you said, because if I want to colonize these entities, my tools can guarantee when I'm oppressing them, suppressing them, induce them with pain, they will forget something, but they will not forget themselves. So when the elements of inducement, indoctrination, that is not good or bad. It's, I indoctrinate my kids to believe in Santa. You know, it's my belief. So the thing is, when these tools stops, there's no alternative for the people of Ukraine to adopt. There's nothingness. So this is the big question. It's an utter nonsense of all what they are doing now.
Thank you, colleagues. You want to add something?
Yes, I also wanted to say, because we have people who work in the Global South, I wonder, well, if we look at the Global Democracy Index today, Russian neighbors, the former colonies, are more democratic than Russia. Russia is the most backward country in terms of democracy. And usually the metropole is kind of democratic and then says that, you know, the others are not democratic, etc. But in our case, it's the other way around. Democracies are predictable, democracies are good partners. Russia is unpredictable. We don't know. Everyone is scared. There are so many theories about what will be next. People don't believe it. There is no trust. The erosion of speech, the erosion of communication, simply because of these one countries, one expensive empire it destroys kind of our communication, trust into our thinking, trust into ourselves. It's a very unpredictable that erodes kind of the international order, right? And the former, and this is something that one really needs to learn about Ukraine, is that first of all of the neighbors, Russian neighbors, former colonies are more democratic, are more progressive on all terms, are more predictable and reliable partners who cooperate with each other, but also with the other countries. And today, Russia is trying to destroy that. And so this is something also, I think, that one really needs to bring up as more often when we speak about other regions and with other regions in the world.
Bruno?
So I just wanted to say quickly that I'm increasingly frustrated with this idea that this war is about Russia's defeat. We have to turn it around and say it's about Ukraine's victory. Because after all, it's perfectly conceivable that both Russia and Ukraine would come out of the war destroyed. Is this something we in the West should celebrate? No. Ukraine has to come out of the war with all its territory, with a vibrant society integrated in the European Union, where people can pursue their dreams. And it's not enough to destroy Russia. But the discourse is somehow moving in that direction, where we would be happy as long as Russia is stopped. And even in Europe, I see more and more of the idea that the real problem is that Russia may attack us next. But that's not, in my mind, that's not the main problem. The main problem is that Ukraine has to survive and to thrive.
Well, I think we Ukrainians are kind of very, very far away from this illusion that Russia can be destroyed very quickly. Of course, there is a kind of a dream, but we need to be realistic. And we see how the Soviet Union was collapsing. In order to have the Soviet Union collapse in 1991, you had to have something inside Soviet Union already in 1922. I mean, quasi-sovereignty of the so-called Soviet Republic. So this is a long process. In order to have Ottoman Empire collapsing after the First World War, you needed to have Serbian independence, Greek independence, those movements from the early 19th century. So this is a long process. We Ukrainians have patience, and we are confident that it will happen soon in the future. If not on our lifespan, then on our lifespan of our children. Thank you so much for this conversation, Rory, Bruno, Raji, David, and Botakoz.
Thank you, Volodymyr.